Ulysses, wake up.
In 1981, a hero made a choice that any parent would make. He saved his son, and the gods punished him for it by condemning him to wander the universe alone, forever, surrounded by a crew he couldn't wake up. That sentence right there is the entire premise, and it's one of the most quietly devastating things children's television ever tried to do. Here's what we're covering today: the world, the characters, the journey, and the ending. Because unlike almost every other show from that era, this one actually had one. 26 episodes, a complete story, and a finale that earned everything it asked you to feel. Cast your mind back to 1981. You're in front of the TV, maybe after school, maybe on a Saturday morning, with a bowl of cereal slowly going soggy. And this French-Japanese animated epic appears on your screen like it fell out of a fever dream. Greek mythology in space. Not as a joke or a gimmick, but as a genuinely committed dramatic premise. A hero who defied the gods and spent an entire series suffering the consequences. It was unlike anything else on television, and for the kids who found it, it left a mark that never quite faded. If forgotten shows that actually finished their story are your thing, subscribing means you won't miss what's coming next on this channel. So here's the thing about Ulysses 31. What it was doing, structurally, emotionally, narratively, was something the Saturday morning slot had no real framework for. Let's get into it. The story. Part 1. The world and heroes.
It's a strange place. Stay alert.
The universe like nothing else. The 31st century, as envisioned by Ulysses 31, looked nothing like Star Trek promised us. Humanity had spread across the cosmos, but so had the ancient Greek gods. Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, they weren't myths or dusty legends anymore. They were real, present, and absolutely did not appreciate being challenged. The divine pantheon had simply scaled up alongside human civilization, moving from Mount Olympus to the heavens in a literal sense, still wielding power over mortal lives with the same petty, magnificent cruelty Homer wrote about 3,000 years ago. This was space opera meets classical mythology. And think about what the show was actually doing. Taking the Odyssey, one of the oldest stories in Western literature, and asking what it would look like if Homer had access to laser cannons and faster-than-light travel. The answer turned out to be something gorgeous and strange and surprisingly moving. When the show premiered as a co-production between the French studio DIC and Japan's Tatsunoko Productions, it arrived as something genuinely different from everything else aimed at kids. This wasn't robots punching each other or teenagers piloting giant mechs. This was a father's desperate journey home, cursed by beings older than civilization itself, with no guaranteed happy ending built into the premise. The central mission was achingly simple to state: find the kingdom of Hades and return to Earth. What it cost to get there was another matter. The hero we needed. Ulysses himself was not your typical cartoon hero. He wasn't cocky or effortlessly cool. He was a father, and the show never let you forget it. Everything flows from a single choice. He destroyed the great Cyclops to save his son Telemachus. A completely understandable act. The Olympian gods, however, do not traffic in understandable. They condemned Ulysses to wander the cosmos indefinitely, searching for a path home that always seemed to recede just as he approached it. His crew frozen in suspended animation as a constant reminder of the price of his defiance. What made Ulysses compelling across 26 episodes wasn't strength or gadgetry, it was his absolute refusal to break. The gods threw monsters, temptations, and impossible moral choices at him with the casual cruelty of beings who have eternity to burn. And episode after episode, he absorbed it and kept going. Not because he was fearless, but because he had people depending on him. His son, his frozen crew, the small, unlikely family that had formed around his misfortune. His driving principle was simple: protect those who depend on you, regardless of the cost. Every kid watching understood that, even if they couldn't have articulated why it hit so hard. The sleeping crew. The detail that made Ulysses 31 genuinely heartbreaking and sets it apart from nearly every other adventure series of its era is what the gods actually did to his crew. They weren't killed. They were suspended, frozen in animation aboard the ship, eyes open, seeing nothing, floating like ghosts through every episode. The punishment wasn't exile alone, it was isolation. Ulysses had to face the entire universe with companions he couldn't talk to, couldn't ask for help, couldn't even properly grieve. The only crew members spared were his son Telemachus, a girl named Yumi from another world, and Nono, a small, round, cheerfully incompetent robot who provided most of the show's comic relief. That was the support system pitted against the assembled forces of Olympus, a grieving father, his kid, an alien girl still figuring out her place in this nightmare, and a robot who occasionally saved the day by accident. Telemachus carried both his father's courage and his vulnerability, and the show used that combination relentlessly. He was kidnapped, endangered, and held as leverage against Ulysses more times than you'd expect a children's series to attempt. Their relationship, the specific love of a parent trying to hold everything together for a child who is watching him try, was the emotional engine the whole series ran on. The gods who wouldn't let go. Zeus and Poseidon were not cartoon villains in any conventional sense. There was no mustache twirling, no explaining their plans to henchmen. They were forces of nature wearing human faces, ancient powers who viewed mortals as pieces on a board rather than beings with any legitimate claim to autonomy. When Ulysses destroyed the Cyclops, Poseidon's own creation, he didn't just commit a crime. He committed hubris, which in Greek mythology is the one thing the gods cannot let pass unpunished. What made them genuinely menacing was their patience. They had eternity. Ulysses had a human lifespan and a son who deserved a childhood somewhere other than a wandering spacecraft. The asymmetry never went away, and the show understood that the most frightening adversaries aren't the ones who want to destroy you, but the ones who simply want to wait you out. Part 2. The Journey and Ending.
Ulysses, wake up.
Episodes burned into memory. If you watched Ulysses 31 as a child, certain images probably stayed with you in ways you couldn't fully explain at the time. The opening sequence alone, that haunting synthesizer theme, the Odyssey gliding through cosmic darkness, the sense of both adventure and grief baked into the same 30 seconds, was doing something most children's television never attempted. Kids were humming that melody on playgrounds without understanding why it made them feel something they didn't have a word for. The episodes drew from Greek mythology and put it through a science fiction filter in consistently inventive ways. The sirens weren't women on rocks, they were something stranger and more disturbing. The Lotus Eaters didn't offer flowers, they offered a kind of technological oblivion that hit a little close to home even then. Circe, Scylla, and Charybdis, the descent into the underworld, all of it translated into 31st century terms without losing what made the original myths unsettling. The show trusted its source material and trusted its audience to follow along. What lingered most, though, was the tone. This was not a show that softened its edges for Saturday morning. The consequences felt real. The loneliness felt real. When things went badly for Ulysses, there was no reset button. He carried it forward into the next episode, and the one after that. The long road through the stars. The longer the series ran, the more weight accumulated on Ulysses' shoulders, and the show didn't try to lighten it artificially. He wasn't just facing external threats, he was living with the knowledge that every decision he made could doom his frozen crew permanently. Every victory came with a price. The series understood something that a lot of children's entertainment missed entirely. Heroes suffer. That's not a flaw in the story. That's the story. The frozen companions haunted every frame almost oppressively. Their faces appeared in brief cuts throughout episodes, eyes open, still, unseeing, as a constant visual reminder of what Ulysses was actually fighting for. Not glory or revenge, but the chance to undo what was done to people who had followed him and paid for it. Character development happened slowly and honestly. Telemachus moved across the series from a frightened boy who needed protecting to a young man actively fighting beside his father. Not through some tidy training montage, but through accumulated experience and loss. Yumi brought an outsider's perspective that gave the show room to examine its own mythology from an unexpected angle, And even Nono managed the occasional moment of real courage beneath the pratfalls. The victories were hard won, the defeats landed heavily, and through all of it, the goal never changed. Wake the crew, find the kingdom of Hades, and get home. The Triumph of the Gods. The final episode, The Triumph of the Gods, arrives at exactly the confrontation the series had been building toward from the start. After everything Ulysses had endured, every monster defeated, every temptation resisted, the gods made their final move. They took Telemachus. Zeus and Poseidon, the most powerful beings in the cosmos, held Ulysses' son hostage with a simple demand: surrender. Submit. Accept that a mortal cannot defy Olympus and walk away from it. It was the one vulnerability they'd always known he had. Everything Ulysses had done, every sacrifice and every mile of the journey, had been for his son. Now his son was the price of giving up. The gods had the leverage, they had the patience, and they were certain they had finally won. He refused. Through something that looked from the outside like madness and felt from the inside like the only option left, Ulysses confronted the divine powers directly, and he won. Not easily, not cleanly, but genuinely. He broke through. The gods, who had been so patient and so certain, found themselves outmaneuvered by a man who simply would not stop. The curse finally broken. Their power over Ulysses was broken, not destroyed, because you cannot destroy gods, but ended as it applied to him and his crew. And then came the moment that the entire series had been building toward. The suspended companions woke up. Eyes that had been open and empty for 26 episodes finally focused. Bodies that had floated in silence finally moved. The crew came back fully into the world, and Ulysses, who had spoken to no one but a teenager, an alien girl, and a small round robot for the entire journey, was surrounded by the people he'd been trying to save since the beginning. It's hard to overstate what that landing meant to audiences who'd watched the whole run. It wasn't a dream sequence, it wasn't a trick. The curse was genuinely lifted. His endless journey, his refusal to submit, all of it had been worth something. He was given permission to return to Earth. After all of it, Ulysses completed his quest. He got his son back. He got his crew back. He went home. The legacy that endured. The series concluded after those 26 episodes as a complete, planned narrative. There were conversations about a second season that never came together, and the unanswered question of what further adventures the 31st century might have held has lingered for fans ever since. But the first season stood on its own as a whole story, which is rarer in this genre than it should be. Ulysses 31 holds an unusual place in animation history. It was one of the first significant French-Japanese co-productions, and the collaboration showed. European storytelling sensibilities and literary ambitions fused with the visual style of late 70s anime, producing something that looked like nothing else on television. Gorgeous, melancholic, and distinctive in ways that held up through decades of reruns and home video releases, and, eventually, streaming. Its influence moved through science fiction animation that came after it, proof that children's programming could take on sacrifice, isolation, and defiance against overwhelming odds without flinching. The show treated its young audience as capable of handling a real story with real weight, and that respect is part of why the people who watched it as children still talk about it. Some things you carry because they were fun. Some things you carry because they meant something. Ulysses 31 was the second kind. This show gave us something rare. A complete story about a hero who actually finished what he started. Through 26 episodes of cosmic loneliness and divine punishment, and odds that were never really in his favor, we watched one man refuse to give up. Not because he was invincible or because the plot demanded it, but because he had people to come home to. And when the credits rolled on that final episode, he won. Properly won. His crew woke up. His son was safe. He made it home. For a generation of kids who sat in front of this show not quite knowing what they were watching, that mattered. The memory of it clearly still does. I genuinely love to know which part of the show stuck with you most. Ulysses himself, the father who held it all together? Telemachus, growing up in the shadow of gods? Or maybe those frozen companions finally opening their eyes? Leave it in the comments. This is the kind of show that deserves that conversation.